This lecture for History 370, Modern East Asia, will cover Section 9, Communist Asia to the 1970s. Our objectives for this section are to understand what the early goals of the communist governments of China and North Korea were, to understand how they tried to fulfill those goals, and to understand how successful they were in doing so and why. Now, in terms of the early goals for the Chinese Communist Party and for the China that they governed, remember they have won the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Their primary goal first is simply to actually unify the country, right? Remember, Chiang Kai-shek had a partial unity, but he had never been able to control all the warlords completely. The communists want to make sure that they truly unify the country, and to a large extent they are successful. The only area of central importance that they're not able to get a hold of is Taiwan. Remember, that's the island where the nationalists are going to flee to. So they're not able to get that part of China. But they are able to unify much of the country, particularly the continental part of China. One of their early goals was to reassert order, right? China had, remember, gone through a civil war, had gone through a Japanese invasion that blew up into World War II, and then another civil war. So there was a lot of chaos that they needed to deal with. They needed to kind of return to normalcy to bring order in a chaotic society. They also wanted to stabilize the economy. The economy was not going well in China. There was, in particular, rampant inflation and problems with corruption, and the communists needed to deal with that as well. Remember also one of the major spurs, one of the major reasons why there was this growing Chinese nationalism was in response to massive foreign influence, even oppression of China, right? And so one thing that this government needed to do was assert a strong Chinese foreign policy to make sure that any foreigners, any non-Chinese in China followed the rules and were not there in a position of power, but were there because the Chinese wanted them there for some reason. And they're going to be largely successful in maintaining those goals. And they also want, as part of limiting foreign influence, they want to strengthen China in order to maintain its independence, to make sure that China is going to be an actor on the world stage rather than someone who is mostly just acted upon. And one thing we have to stress is that these early goals will generally be accomplished, right? These early goals will generally be accomplished. Now, how are they going to be accomplished? Well, the idea is that communism will achieve them through a complete revolution directed by the Communist Party state. So they actually understand themselves as a revolutionary party, right? So this isn't just someone who's going to bring in a few reforms. They understand that they have a mandate to completely transform society. So these early goals are something that pretty much they shared with the nationalists, right? This is something that the nationalists would have all agreed on that needed to be done. It's just the nationalists thought they should do it, not the communists. But also, and we're going to talk more about this later, the communists want to achieve a complete revolution. Who will be in charge of the revolution? The state dominated by the Communist Party, right? Both the nationalists and the communists were seeking to develop a single party state, right? Which is not what we think of when we think of democracy. We have multiple political parties, but they believed, both of them, that in order to discipline, to transform China, to make it a strong state, you had to have one party in charge. They just disagreed about which party that should be. But in any case, I also want to emphasize that the communists, as we'll see, are going to go further in how they want to transform China than the nationalists. One thing that will kind of help us to understand this is looking at China's new flag. So when you think about the American flag, we had the 50 stars, 1 star for each state, and the 13 stripes representing the 13 colonies. And that represents kind of our adherence to federalism, to that shared power between the states, and our notion of our country as consisting of a particular territory. China's flag, first of all, is red. That is the color of communism. And there are 5 stars, and 1 star is much bigger. Now, there are different interpretations of what the 4 smaller stars are, but one of, I think, the most prevalent is that they represent different economic classes that are considered the good classes. So, for example, one of those stars are the peasants, one of the stars is the workers, And you can then probably guess that the big star represents the Communist Party, right? So this is a party state in which the flag has a meaning connected to that party, right? The big star represents the party, and the four smaller stars represent, in a sense, the classes, the economic classes that support the party. So the flag itself is connected to ideology, and of course, like I said, it's red, meaning communism. And I like to also refer to this as a party nation state, right? A nation state is a state that is closely connected to a nation, and China was certainly a nation state, right? The Chinese nation has its own state. A party nation state is when the nation state is dominated by one political party, which is what we have in communist China. And there is a saying, of course, encouraged by the Communist Party, that without the Communist Party, there would be no new China, right? Without the Communist Party, there would be no new China. And the idea here is basically twofold. One is to make them inseparable. The idea of a China without a Communist Party is meant to be unthinkable. But especially what I want to focus on in this part is that there's this idea that the party controls the nation state because it knows what has to be done, right? The party controls the nation state because it knows what has to be done. So what do the communists want to do, right? And how are they going to do it? Right, I talked about some basic goals that they share with the nationalists, and you can see some of those goals here in this picture on the right, and that represents, that's from the early 1950s, that poster, and it represents what the communists were basically making a promise to the Chinese. And it's interesting because it affirms family life, because it focuses on the family, right? You have, they're all well clothed, they're all well fed, they're sitting down to a full meal, and you can tell they're all well fed. Look, I mean, look at that baby on the left. I mean, he's very chubby. That's good. You want babies to be chubby. Believe me, as a parent, if when they get sick, all that weight falls off of them very quickly. So you want them to be nice and healthy, and that's a sign of a healthy child. So there's this idea of having enough food to eat, of being healthy, of being well clothed, but there also are symbols of luxury. There's a clock. There's a vase with flowers. There is a ball and a little toy horse. So the communists are promising that we're not only going to make sure you have enough food to eat, clothes to wear, a nice place to live. That was essentially what the old imperial system had promised. We're also promising you luxuries. And you may say, this is a luxury? Well, it was for Chinese people in this time period. Of course, there's also a little calendar with a dove promising peace. And you've got a picture of Mao Zedong in the background, meaning he's going to be the one that brings all this to you. More on him later. But again, there's this idea, in a sense shared with nationalists, that there's going to be this complete remaking of society. What makes the communists different fundamentally from the nationalists was how deep they wanted to remake society. As we'll see, the communists will go a lot farther than the nationalists. And also, in particular, who are you remaking society for, right? The nationalists tended to focus more on the middle classes, the business classes, landlords, wealthier people, middle class and up. The communists, though, want to focus on equality and liberation, particularly for the workers and the peasants. From their perspective, those are the classes who essentially the revolution was undertaken for. And in particular, they want to make sure that those people are now raised to equal positions, right? They were the oppressed. They need to be raised so they will no longer be oppressed. Remember, in communism, there's this understanding that the oppressor class governs the oppressed. This revolution was undertaken for the oppressed. So these people, these workers and peasants, they're the ones who are supposed to be leading society now, right? They're the ones who are leading society now. And it's time for payback against the oppressors, right? And this is what fundamentally makes the communists different from the nationalists. The nationalists favored, right, the middle classes and the upper classes, the landlords, the business people, and so forth. The communists said, no, they're the oppressors. We need to revolutionize China to benefit the oppressed, the workers, and the peasants. In this section, we'll talk a little bit more about the peasants, and we'll talk about how the revolution, in a sense, fails them. But before we do that, we need to talk about how there, though, was a division among communists about how this was to be done. Right? Communists agree. We need to have a revolution, thoroughgoing transformation of the Chinese society and economy that primarily benefits the workers and the peasants, even if it hurts these middle and upper class people because they were the oppressors anyway. Some Chinese, though, want gradual development that looks to the outside world and technical experts to build a strong country. Right? Some want gradual developments that looks to the outside world and technical experts to build a strong country. Others want rapid development that looks to the revolutionary fervor of people to build a strong country. Right? So they agree on the goal. Right? The communists agree on the goal. The means, though, is very different. Right? Do we want slow, gradual development that is based around technology? Or do we want rapid development that is based around the revolutionary fervor of our people? Now, at first, China is going to try that basic, technologically centered way of development, right? We'll focus on technology, and that means working with countries outside of China. And of course, the major country to work with, to import technology from, to learn from, would be the Soviet Union, right? Which is accepted by China and the communist countries of the world as the leader of the communist world, right? Now, China and the Soviet Union have a close but complex relationship during this time period because, of course, on one side, the Soviet Union has technology, has assistance that the Chinese need, but at the same time, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Revolution in China, he feels that he has actually led a revolution like Stalin had helped do, the leader of the Soviet Union, and so he felt that they should be more close in terms of equals, right? While he's alive, Mao is willing to accept the Soviet Union kind of grudgingly as the older brother and China as the younger brother. When Stalin dies in 1953, Mao will turn away from that increasingly. He does not see the leader who succeeds Stalin, Khrushchev, as his equal because Khrushchev had never led a revolution, whereas Mao had. But in the early 1950s, China and the Soviet Union, the USSR, will form a close relationship in which China will receive some financial support, though they do have to accept an independent Mongolia, which the Soviet Union wanted as a buffer state. That was an area that China had claimed as part of its territory, but it's going to give up that territorial claim. But they will receive some financial support, but in particular, they will receive military technology and advice. So in this early 1950s, in order to accomplish this construction of a strong country, this economic development, a lot of it's going to be based around technology and advice coming from the Soviet Union. Now, the Chinese have to pay for a lot of this, but they do need, in a sense, this assistance early on to follow this path. And you can kind of see I included these two pictures. One is a stamp celebrating this kind of alliance that they're forming in 1950. And on the bottom one, you can see a Soviet, a communist Russian, giving the Chinese workers advice on how to build up technology. And one thing that China will do, following what the Soviet Union does, and many countries, in fact, will do, is they will have a 5-year plan. Basically, in this communist system, as in any kind of authoritarian government, there's a belief that you need to control the economy in order to make the economy both work efficiently, but also to distribute wealth evenly, right? There's this idea if you just leave the market to itself, then unscrupulous people will oppress other people, and that's where you get capitalists and the bourgeoisie and all that. According to the communist perspective, if we develop a centralized economy based around this scientifically correct doctrine of communism, we can direct resources and make sure that they are used efficiently. And I want to stress, as you know, I mentioned earlier, I'm not a communist. I'm definitely not. I'm pretty much about as anti-communist as you can get. When you're working with a country that is having that's kind of economically in need of a lot of development, 5-year plans are a good idea. And there is some truth to having a government that disciplines the economy, even plans it to a large degree, can really help, right? Because you can make sure that resources are used efficiently because you plan out what you need. So, for example, this poster here is illustrating how steel is the basis of a lot of industry, right? So you can see there's a steel plant on top, and then in the middle, there's this phrase explaining how steel is used in all these things, and it shows, we need steel for tractors, we need steel for ships, we need steel for buildings, and the idea here is, okay, if we want to develop these industries later, we need to first make sure that we have a stable foundation in terms of steel production, right? And if we want to build up our steel production so we can build tanks and we can build tractors, we need coal, because we need coal in order to make steel. That's what, in a sense, is the fuel that allows for any kind of production. In this case, is coal, right? So we're going to set a 5-year plan. We know in the future we want this many tractors, right? We want this many tanks. So we know we need to produce this much coal. We need to produce this much steel. So the first 5-year plan, which will last from 1952 to 1957, notice they launch it during the Korean War, actually proves to be pretty successful. This idea of centralized planning in this time period when the economy is fairly simple and needs developing works pretty well. For example, coal will increase by 115% of its goal, so they exceed the amount of coal that they thought they could produce. 130% of steel. So not only did they complete their goal of steel, they actually made almost a third as much steel as that they thought they would initially. Twice as many machine tools needed for industry, almost twice as many trucks as they thought they would do, and the economy grew almost 9% each year. Agriculture didn't grow as much as they would like, but it still went up by 3.8%. And industry itself developed 18.7% growth. That's not bad, right? This is a war-ravaged country, but they're starting to put things back together again. And remember how we said this was supposed to be a revolution from the communist perspective that helped workers and peasants? Well, they're benefiting too. The wages of workers go up. Peasant income goes up. And one thing that's pretty impressive is life expectancy will go way up, right? So we have some real benefits coming out of this early communist rule, right? Like I said before, they are successful in restoring order and getting the economy on track. And this 5-year plan seems to be working really, really well. As a historian, I often find myself saying, yeah, things are going really well. And then things start going bad. So I now have to talk about some problems that are going to arise and some of the tensions, some of the contradictions in the goals of the Communist Party. So first of all, the promise of land reform was very, very important. Remember, Mao Zedong had said that the important class were the peasants and that you could achieve a communist revolution with the peasants. Well, how do you get the peasants on board? How do you get the peasants to support you? You promise them land, right? Land in China was extraordinarily important. In the communist view on things, China was basically stuck in feudalism. It hadn't really got to capitalism. In feudalism, land is the most important producer of wealth. So everyone in China wanted land, basically. And especially farmers who didn't have much land wanted more. So one of the ways that the communists got the peasants to support them was to promise land reform and to carry out land reform in areas that they controlled. So that's what they did. And this led to a lot of support from the farmers. And here you can see kind of a propaganda poster in which farmers are very happily obtaining their deeds to land, right? So land is being taken from the landlords, from the middle class, from religious organizations, and given to the farmers. And they're very happy about that. And I don't think this poster is making this up. I think they were happy about that because they were being given land. One thing, though, we have to stress about land reform was it could be incredibly violent. Estimates vary. I've heard as low as 100,000, but I think now as we're understanding more, there's more research being done, the number's increasingly being brought up. But it seems land reform, probably about 1.5 to 2 million people died in the process of land reform. Because how do you justify taking someone's land? Well, they must have been an oppressor, right? The landlords, the people of the land, well, they must have been oppressing the peasants, the common people. That's how they got so wealthy. Remember, in communism, you're either the oppressor or the oppressed. So it's justifiable to execute these people. Now, not every single landlord was executed, but a lot were. And you can see that picture on the right is kind of the trial that would be given these landlords, and they could be berated for days by the local villagers. Eventually, they would be sentenced, often to death, and then their land would be taken and distributed to the villagers. So the peasants, of course, were very happy about this. The landlords weren't, but Mao was correct in that the peasants were going to be the moving force. So the peasants were happy to receive the promised land, and they therefore supported the government. But there's a fundamental problem here, and this leads to kind of a tension, a contradiction within communist goals. There was insufficient agricultural growth to support rising industrialization. Note, in that 5-year plan, agricultural sector did not grow that much. And the problem is, eating into that growth was the growing population, right? The number of Chinese people was growing. In order to have industrialization, you have to have enough food to feed people who are no longer growing food, but working in factories, right? If we take someone off the land and put them in a factory to build stuff, that's great. They can make stuff, but they still have to eat, right? So you have to raise agricultural productivity if you want to industrialize, right? If you want to have people working in factories, the farmers who are left have to grow that much more food. And the problem is the farmers are not capable with what's available in terms of technology to really grow enough to meet the needs for industrialization, at least at the scope, the speed that even the people who wanted gradual reform wanted, right? So there's a fundamental problem with this technologically based reform. It doesn't seem to be fast enough, right? And it doesn't seem to be able to deal with this fundamental problem. We're not growing enough food to move as quickly as we need to build a strong, independent country. Remember, the Cold War is going on, and there's this fear among the communists that if they don't industrialize quickly, they're going to be in trouble. They might even be overthrown, right? The anti-communists might invade and destroy communism, right? So there's a sense of urgency to industrialization. And it's just not working fast enough, in a large part because of problems in the agricultural sector. So one thing the Communist Party did in order to encourage agricultural efficiency and productivity was to pressure peasants to join cooperatives. And if you're not familiar with farming, a co-op is kind of a voluntary association of farmers that work together to share equipment, to share labor, to share tools. And this actually can be very efficient. So for example, you may have 10 families who are too poor to buy a tractor, but together they could buy a tractor, right? If they were to pool their resources, and then they could share the tractor. That's essentially what a cooperative is. And early on, the communist government pressured or even simply encouraged people to join cooperatives. And some people did join the cooperatives, and this did increase some efficiency. But not as much as the party wanted to deal with this kind of development. So they increased the pressure, and they even added the idea of joining collectives. And in a collective, you completely gave up all your property and shared everything with other people, with the idea that this would be more efficient because you'd have a kind of economy of scale, right? If we all pool our land together and we all work that land together and we all share the tools and the equipment together, we can organize things better, we can work more efficiently. That was the idea. Peasants didn't really like that idea because, the whole reason they supported the communists was because the communists promised that they would get their own land, and they didn't really want to just turn around and give back the land that they had just gotten. However, because the 5-year plan is not as successful as the Communist Party had hoped in terms of raising agricultural productivity, in 1958, private ownership of land will be abolished. Right, in 1958, private ownership of land will be abolished. And I really want to emphasize this. This is, frankly speaking, why one reason I'm an anti-communist was they told the peasants, support us and we will give you land. And then only like a few years later, they turned around and said, yeah, we're taking the land. We need it back. Thank you very much. And of course, the peasants, it's like, they're peasants. I don't want to be too hard on them, but you guys, like, when the government is saying, let's kill people and take their land, don't you think that they might take the land back from you if they wanted? Right? Like, you're saying, let's kill these landlords and let's take their land. Well, you've just totally given up on the idea of property rights, and now the government can just take the land from you. But in any case, the peasants can't do anything, and they're very angry and bitter about this, but they really can't do anything about it. So in 1958, private ownership of land was abolished. What will happen then, and the idea, the government does this because they believe it will increase productivity, right? We can work things more efficiently in these collectives, right? If we make the peasants give up their private land and basically make them work on these collectives, we can do things more efficiently. Now, here's the thing, bluntly speaking, even if it wasn't more efficient, the government really didn't care. Collectives allowed the government to control the peasants and to extract grain and other agricultural products from them more efficiently, right? The collective was controlled by the Communist Party more directly than, say, a family farm, and that allowed the communists to make sure that they got the food they needed to give to workers so they could industrialize. So even if they promised it would increase productivity, it actually didn't. People work better typically in family units who get to profit from the fruits of their labors, but the government didn't really care that much because the major purpose was it gave the government more access, more control over the grain being produced that could then be used to feed the workers. Basically, the idea here is that the government wants to industrialize based on extracting grain from the countryside to feed workers and to pay for imported technology, right? We need grain to feed workers, and we can sell grain on the market to other countries to get money we need in order to import technology. So here's the fundamental tension, the fundamental problem that the Communist Party governing China faced. And sometimes I say Communist Party, sometimes I say the government. Remember, this is a party state, so both are correct. The government promised to make China strong. It also promised peasant prosperity. And it promised land to the peasants. But now it has to choose which one is most important, national strength or peasant prosperity and peasant land. And in the end, they chose national strength, right? They have to choose, right? Do we take policies that benefit the peasants, such as land reform, or do we choose policies that promise to make the country stronger? They chose to make the country stronger. Now, I think that they would respond, well, look, we got to make the country stronger. All our gains might be lost, right? We have to make the country strong because if our government is overthrown, then that's it, right? Then the oppressors will come back. I think that that would be the communist response, and it's a logical response. The issue I have, right? The issue I have with that is that these things can just always be pushed back. You can always push back and say, well, we're still in trouble. We can't really help the peasants out. But the peasants themselves, of course, are very bitter about this because they're like, look, we protected you, communists. We helped you. We're key to why you win the war against the nationalists. And now that you don't need us anymore, you're not going to keep your promise. You're going to throw us away. And this led to a lot of bitterness among many peasants. It's going to lead to worse things, as we shall see.